No one expected Grandpa to leave behind anything but stories. Most of them ended in disappointment, just like he had. I'm 32, rent a one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, and work the kind of job where you pray the manager forgets you're still on shift. Nothing glamorous. Admin assistant by title, glorified errand runner by reality. It's not what I dreamed of doing, but after you've learned to expect little, settling becomes second nature. You just survive. Quietly. Efficiently. My family never had a history of warmth. We weren't the kind to gather for Sunday dinners or take matching Christmas photos. Love in our house was meted out in small, conditional doses. If you earned it, if you played by their rules, if you didn't make a fuss. And I made a fuss. Blah. By the time I was 13, I'd figured out that being the quiet one didn't get you noticed, but being different did. I wasn't as pretty as my cousins, not as charming as my older brother, and definitely not as obedient as my mother wanted. I read too much, asked too many questions, didn't fake smiles well enough. Over time I became easy to forget at family gatherings, and eventually easier not to invite. Grandpa wasn't much better. At least that's what I thought for most of my life. He was the kind of man who sat in his chair during birthdays and barbecues, sipping from a chipped mug and watching everything like a judge in a silent courtroom. He didn't speak unless you asked him something directly, and even then, his answers were often one-word dismissals. I remember once, when I was about 9, I brought him a picture I'd drawn of his old fishing boat. He glanced at it and grunted. No thank you, no smile, just that grunt. I threw it away before we left. It wasn't that he was cruel, just distant, like everyone else. He passed away last week. Peacefully, they said. Though it's hard to imagine a man like that doing anything peacefully. I got the call from my aunt while I was in the break room, eating soggy noodles from a Tupperware container. Figured you should know, she said, her voice flat. The funeral's Saturday. You don't have to come. But I did. Not because I expected anything, and certainly not because I thought I belonged there. I went out of some strange sense of closure, or maybe just curiosity. What does a man like that leave behind? Old boots. Broken tools. A long list of people disappointed he didn't try harder. Walking into that chapel was like stepping into a room full of ghosts. Everyone wore black, but it felt more like a performance than mourning. My uncle shook my hand like I was a stranger. My cousins whispered and pretended not to see me. And through it all I kept thinking, no one expected Grandpa to leave behind anything but stories. Turns out we were all wrong that I didn't cry at the funeral. Not because I didn't care, but because I'd learned long ago that caring too much meant getting hurt. It was held at a modest chapel on the edge of town, the kind that smelled faintly of old hymn books and cleaning spray. Grandpa wasn't the church-going type, but I guess someone figured it was traditional. The pews were half full, which was more than I expected. People always seem to show up when there's a will involved. Uncle Ray was the first one I spotted, broad-shouldered, red-faced, and still wearing that gaudy gold watch he never stops talking about. He hugged the pastor like they were old friends, even though I'm pretty sure the last time he saw a church was when he got married the first time. He walked around the room, shaking hands, patting shoulders, making sure everyone saw him. His grief looked more like networking. Then came Aunt Linda, my mom's older sister, dressed like she was going to a gala instead of a funeral. Black silk scarf, dramatic sunglasses indoors, and a face too tight with filler to allow any real expression. She air-kissed cheeks and whispered behind her hand, mostly about how sad everything was, but the kind of sad that left room for smugness. She was the one who'd always told me, "Don't expect much from this family, sweetheart. It's survival of the fittest." She made it sound like wisdom, not a warning. My cousin Ashley arrived late, of course, with her boyfriend of the month and a designer handbag I'm convinced was fake. She didn't look up from her phone once during the service. Ashley had been Grandpa's favorite, if you believed her, which most of the family did. She was the pretty one, the charming one, the one who always knew how to be sweet when it counted and mean when it didn't. There were others, distant cousins, neighbors, a few old men from Grandpa's fishing club, but none of them seemed genuinely affected. Conversations were hushed but not solemn. People whispered about who was going to get what Grandpa might have been sitting on, and whether he ever finally sold that old cabin in Lake County. I sat in the third row, alone, watching it all like a spectator at a play I hadn't auditioned for. I didn't belong on that stage anymore. Maybe I never did. The service itself was short. A few standard prayers, a generic eulogy delivered by a man who clearly never met Grandpa, and then a slow shuffle out to the parking lot where everyone stood around pretending to reminisce. I heard snippets. Remember when he used to? God, I hope he left that rifle collection to someone who'll appreciate it. He probably had more money than he let on, you know. Kept quiet. I knew better than to expect anything. My mother always said Grandpa had no patience for emotional girls, and apparently I'd been born too full of feelings. Over the years, that criticism morphed into distance. Phone calls got shorter. Invitations stopped. Eventually I stopped reaching out too. So no, I didn't expect a thing from him. Not a letter. Not a dime. Not a single word in a will that probably listed off everything he owned in a neat, tiny bullet point list and handed it all to Uncle Ray and Ashley. Still I stayed. I shook hands. I smiled when appropriate. I watched the vultures circle. And when someone mentioned the reading of the will happening the next morning, I told myself I wasn't going to go. But I did. The law office was as cold and impersonal as I'd expected. Gray walls, a dusty plant in the corner, and a long mahogany table too polished to feel real. Everything smelled faintly of paper, old carpet, and stale coffee. It wasn't the kind of place where lives changed. It was the kind of place where lives were reduced to bullet points and signatures. We were ushered into the conference room by a woman in a blazer too tight across the shoulders. She didn't offer her name, just pointed to our seats and said Mr. Lawson would be in shortly. The others took their places like actors finding their marks on stage. Uncle Ray plopped down at the head of the table without hesitation, folding his arms like he already owned the room. Aunt Linda took out a compact mirror and dabbed at imaginary tears. Ashley leaned back in her chair, scrolling through her phone with freshly manicured nails. The rest of the family, 2 cousins, a stepniece, and someone who might have been Grandpa's neighbor, filled in the gaps. I sat near the end, close to the window. It was one of those mornings that couldn't decide whether to rain or shine. Fitting. Mr. Lawson arrived 5 minutes late, carrying a thick leather folder and a calm, unreadable face. He was in his late 50s, with silver hair and a voice that could have narrated audiobooks. When he spoke, the room finally fell quiet. "Thank you all for coming," he began, folding his hands. "I'll be reading the last will and testament of George Edwin Mallory, as executed and signed 2 years ago. Unless otherwise stated, the contents are final and legally binding." Everyone leaned in, hungry for their piece of the pie. Except me. I leaned back and watched. I was here for closure, nothing more. He started with the small stuff. To Cousin Mark, the old fishing rods and tackle box. To Aunt Linda, the antique piano she once begged Grandpa not to sell. To Uncle Ray, a commemorative coin collection, of historical but minimal monetary value. The look on Ray's face was priceless. He blinked like he'd been slapped. Ashley got a wristwatch. To Ashley, who always appreciated appearances, may this help her keep time better than she kept promises. Few snickers slipped out. Even I bit my lip. One by one, they were handed sentimental scraps wrapped in legalese. There was no money, no house, no big final flourish, just trinkets and bitter expressions. The room filled with shifting bodies, clenched jaws and tight smiles. And then Mr. Lawson paused. He flipped the page, cleared his throat, and looked directly at me. Then Mr. Lawson cleared his throat, and everything changed. "To my granddaughter Clara Elise Mallory," he said, his voice steady but heavier now, "I leave the remainder of my estate, including all financial accounts, real property holdings, investments, and personal assets not otherwise designated." The room froze. And blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" Lawson continued. "Per Mr. Mallory's instruction, a full inventory has been prepared. Ms. Mallory will inherit ownership of the Mallory fishing cabin in Lake County, 2 residential rental properties, a diversified investment portfolio, and a savings account totaling approximately $3.8 million. Someone gasped. Ashley dropped her phone. Aunt Linda actually choked on her breath. Uncle Ray sat bolt upright, his face turning the color of undercooked beef. Is this some kind of mistake? Ray snapped, leaning forward. Mr. Lawson didn't flinch. Mr. Mallory's wishes are clearly stated and have been legally notarized. A personal letter addressed to Ms. Mallory is included and will be given to her privately. I didn't speak. Couldn't. I just sat there, heat crawling up my neck, my hands gripping the edge of my chair. Every pair of eyes was on me. Confused, accusatory, disbelieving. Me. Quiet one. Black sheep. The girl no one thought would even bother to show up. I don't understand, I finally said. Why me? Mr. Lawson offered a faint, almost sympathetic smile. Perhaps the letter will help answer that. The rest of the meeting passed in a blur. There were questions, mumbled objections, a few family members storming out. Ashley muttered something about contesting the will. Aunt Linda whispered into her phone, probably texting a lawyer before we even left the building. I sat there stunned as Mr. Lawson handed me a sealed envelope. My name was written in Grandpa's unmistakable handwriting. Tight, sharp, deliberate. Blair. That was it. No dear, no flourish. Just my name, like he'd been waiting for me to finally look. I held the letter in my lap and stared out the window. The sun had broken through the clouds, lighting up the edge of the sky. Everyone had expected Pennies. Had to. I sat in my car for almost 20 minutes before I could open the envelope. It was heavier than I expected, like the paper itself carried weight. His handwriting stared back at me. Clean, sharp, methodical. Claire. No greeting, no warm-up. Just my name, like he knew I'd understand that was enough. I peeled the seal open with trembling fingers. Inside was a single sheet of thick, cream-colored paper, folded once. I could smell his old cologne clinging to the page. I hadn't realized until that moment how much I remembered that scent, like pine, dust, and winter air. Mr. Lawson had offered to read it aloud in his office, but I'd shaken my head. I wanted privacy. I wasn't ready for the stares, the whispers. I needed to sit in silence and try to make sense of what had just happened. $3.8 million. It didn't feel real. Just yesterday I was budgeting groceries down to the penny. And now I apparently own 2 rental homes, a fishing cabin, and a portfolio of old-school stocks my grandfather had quietly invested in over the decades. No one knew. Not even Uncle Ray, who had always claimed to be handling Grandpa's affairs. I unfolded the letter. Blair, I know you're probably shocked, maybe even angry. But I hope before either of those feelings settle in, you'll read this carefully. Really read it. I didn't grow up in a world that encouraged soft hearts or open mouths. You probably already figured that out. I watched my father work until his hands broke and his back gave out, and no one gave him a damn thing for it. He died with nothing, and I told myself I'd never do the same. Save. Quietly. Carefully. And I watched. You were the only one who ever saw me. When you were little, you asked me questions no one else did. You noticed when I wasn't at the dinner table. You brought me that drawing of my boat. I kept it, by the way. Your mom thought I threw it out, but it's still in my top drawer. You didn't need anything from me. That's why I wanted to give you everything. I know our family. They love loudly but conditionally. You were quiet but constant. I saw it, even when no one else did. I never told you how proud I was of you. I figured one day this would say it for me. Use it well. Live wide. Live kind. Don't become like them. Grandpa. I had to put the letter down before I stained it with tears. I sat there stunned as memory after memory came flooding back, not of grand gestures but of quiet ones. The way he'd always saved me the first slice of pie. The time he sat through my entire high school play even though he hated anything with costumes. How, during one particularly bad Christmas when my mom yelled at me in front of everyone, he'd slipped me a folded $20 bill and told me to buy something no one else gets to choose. They were small things. Things I hadn't realized added up to love. I'd spent so long thinking he'd never really noticed me. I thought his silence was disapproval. But now I wondered if it had always been his way of listening. Back at the law office, Mr. Lawson had given me a manila folder. Inside were the details. 2 rental properties, both modest but fully paid off, bringing in steady income. A lakeside fishing cabin, his pride and joy, now mine. A diversified portfolio. Mostly blue-chip stocks, some bonds, a few old mining shares that had somehow exploded in value. A bank account he'd kept hidden from the family, untouched except for the occasional donation to a local veterans shelter. And a note: do not sell the cabin unless you're desperate. You'll understand why when you visit it again. I didn't know what to feel. Guilt tangled with awe. I didn't ask for this. I didn't even think I deserved it. But maybe that's exactly why he left it to me. I thought of everyone else. Uncle Ray, fuming. Aunt Linda, already crafting her lawsuit. Ashley, devastated that a watch was all she got for years of pretending. They were furious, confused, entitled. But Grandpa had seen something different in me. I folded the letter slowly, like it was sacred, and placed it back in the envelope. I didn't know what to do next. I just knew everything had changed. He never told me how proud he was. But now I knew. Suddenly I was rich. But I'd never felt so alone. The news spread like gasoline to a flame. By the time I returned to the law office the next day to sign the preliminary paperwork, the vultures had already circled. Uncle Ray was waiting in the hallway, red-faced and pacing, arms crossed so tightly his biceps bulged. "This is insane," he barked the moment he saw me. "There's no way in hell my father would leave you everything. What kind of manipulation? What kind of lie is this?" Behind him, Aunt Linda stood frozen, lips pursed like she'd just sucked a lemon. "We'll contest," she hissed. "Mark my words. This doesn't hold up. Your grandfather was clearly confused. He wasn't in his right mind." Ashley didn't speak. She just gave me a look I'll never forget. Half betrayal, half disbelief, like I'd mugged her in broad daylight. Her mascara was smudged. She hadn't even bothered to pretend to mourn anymore. I wanted to speak, to explain. But explain what, exactly? That I hadn't asked for any of this. That I was just as stunned as they were. That the man they all assumed was cold and distant had written me a letter full of tenderness and pride. But the words caught in my throat. What was the point? "He barely even talked to you," Ashley finally spat. "You weren't even around. Why would he give you anything, let alone everything?" I swallowed hard. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Maybe because I never asked him to." There was a pause, brief, sharp, and then the room exploded. "You ungrateful little. This is theft, plain theft. He was senile, that lawyer's a fraud. Are you planning to sell everything? Or just hoard it while the rest of us rot?" The accusations came faster than I could absorb them. And the guilt hit hard. A lifetime of feeling invisible had never prepared me for what it felt like to suddenly be the center of attention, for something no one thought I deserved. But beneath the guilt, something else stirred. Power. Not the showy, greedy kind my family coveted, but the quiet kind, the kind that said, "You don't have to play their game anymore." I looked at their faces, people who had only ever seen me as the forgettable cousin, the one who sat quietly in the corner at holidays, the one never invited to weddings or asked about her life. And now they saw me. Now they wanted something from me. Part of me wanted to yell, to scream that I hadn't manipulated anyone, that I'd spent years grieving a family that had never let me in, and now they resented me for finally being seen. But instead I took the letter from my bag and held it up. "This is between me and Grandpa," I said quietly. "Not any of you." They didn't respond. They just stared. Not one of them asked what the letter said. They didn't want to know. Not really. As I turned to leave, Uncle Ray stepped forward like he might grab my arm, but stopped short. The rage in his eyes made my stomach knot, but I held his gaze anyway. I'd spent years letting people like him shrink me. That part of my life was over. I stepped into the hallway, letter clutched in my hand, my heart pounding in my chest. The door closed behind me with a quiet click, cutting off the noise, the blame, the desperation. The world outside looked different somehow, brighter, sharper. Like everything had shifted and I'd stepped into a new version of myself. Yes, I was suddenly wealthy. But the real inheritance wasn't the money. It was clarity. And with it came a loneliness I hadn't expected. I didn't go home right away. Instead, I drove for hours with no destination, letting the road unfold in front of me like a story I hadn't yet read. My phone buzzed over and over. Calls from cousins I hadn't spoken to in years, texts dripping with half-hearted concern and thinly veiled demands. I turned it off. I needed space. I needed silence. Eventually, I pulled into a quiet overlook on the edge of town. The kind of place you go when you want to disappear for a while. I sat on the hood of my car, wrapped in a too-thin sweater, and watched the sun dip below the hills. It didn't feel real. 3 days ago, I was counting tips at the end of my shift at the diner, rationing laundry quarters and debating whether I could afford new tires before winter. My world was small, tightly wound around responsibility and survival. There was never time for dreaming. Dreams cost too much. Now everything was different. But the thing is, money doesn't erase the past. It doesn't unlive the hard years, or undo the moments where I felt invisible. It doesn't erase the double shifts, the lonely birthdays, the student loans I never finished paying because I had to drop out and help Mom when she got sick. Still, as I sat there with Grandpa's letter in my lap, a truth settled over me like a warm blanket. He saw me. He always had. I thought of all the moments that didn't seem to matter then. The times he'd quietly slipped me a 20 for gas, the way he'd always ask how I was really doing, not just what I was doing. He never made a fuss, never said the words. But now I realized he'd loved me in the only way he knew how, with steady eyes and silent loyalty. He didn't just leave me money. He left me a choice to keep living small, quiet, afraid, or to finally live free. That night I made a promise to myself. I wasn't going to blow the inheritance on flashy cars or designer shoes. I wasn't going to hoard it either, terrified it would vanish. I was going to use it, intentionally. I would pay off debts, buy a home of my own, maybe go back to school. Donate, invest, build. But more than that, I'd let it buy me time. Time to breathe, to dream again, to find out who I was when I wasn't just surviving. The money didn't change who I was. But it gave me the space to become more of her. And maybe, just maybe, that was what Grandpa always wanted. The key turned smoothly in the lock. Brand new, never used. My name was on the lease, the deed, the mailbox. For the first time in my life, I wasn't borrowing space or asking permission. The apartment wasn't extravagant. Just a modest, sunlit place on a quiet street with creaky floors and a tiny balcony that overlooked the city skyline. But it was mine. And that made it feel like a palace. Inside there were still unopened boxes. A used bookshelf I'd found at a local thrift store. A stack of course catalogs from the community college downtown. I hadn't made any firm decisions yet, but I knew one thing. I was going back. Maybe not just to school but to myself. There were other ideas forming too. A small non-profit in Grandpa's name. Maybe something for kids who grew up overlooked like I did. Maybe travel. Maybe write. As I stood there on the balcony, the letter in my coat pocket, the weight of old doubts lifted just a little. Everyone expected pennies. But he gave me something richer, dignity, freedom, and the last word.